So as we gather, I am Lisa Kimball. I said this to those of you who were on a little earlier. I am the Associate Dean of Lifelong Learning. I am the privilege of hosting today. And you are here, we hope, by intention and design for the Attending to the Self, Healthy Habits for Sustainable Ministry. So this question of self-care is not a new question for any of us in ministry, but it's one that I know I have to revisit on a regular basis. And to just set the tone, the inside joke is I am not exhibit A for the person who has best self-care practices. I have lived my life in deep prayer with God and my spiritual director, always sort of wrestling with my type A personality, my loving to be engaged in things. So I come to this with great humility, and I certainly have practices that have sustained me to this place, but I have a long way to go. It's a lifelong journey of learning. So I'm here embodying all those parts of any of you that may struggle with this question of how to live in a place of fullness and wellness in the midst of all that is demanded of you. And our guests will guide us through some wisdom for that. So I'm very glad you're here. If you haven't done it yet, do welcome yourself by putting yourself in the chat if you would. We'd love to know that you're here. And yes, anyone else here struggle with wellness? Many of us do, folks. This is something that we talk about it quickly in the church, right? It's something we put in a box and we know that it's important. And then for those of us for whom it's not so natural, it can often be the last thing we take care of. And we'll hear some of that today. So as we begin, we are going to gather in prayer. And we will be together for this hour. Everything that you see is being recorded. The slides will be sent to you tomorrow. They have hyperlinks in them. We'll look at the end at some resources. So you really can be fully present. You don't need to worry about taking notes. They will come to you through the magic of the internet. And we want this to be a time of practicing the very subject we're talking about. Let us pray. O God, by whom the meek are guided in judgment, and the light rises up in darkness for the godly, grant us in all our doubts and uncertainties the grace to ask what you would have us do, that the spirit of wisdom may save us from all false choices, and that in your light we may see light, and in your straight path may not stumble. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Welcome. And I want to welcome my co-panelists and the wonderful person who is behind the scenes making this possible. So let's start there. My colleague, Catherine Malloy, is behind the scenes hosting this event. And we're very grateful to her. She creates the slides. She makes sure the emails get out. She is our Director of Christian Formation and Discipleship at Lifelong Learning. And Catherine, we're very grateful to you. And I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves. Keith, tell us a little about who you are.
Hi, I'm Keith Anderson. I'm the pastor at Upper Dublin Lutheran Church in Ambler, Pennsylvania, which is just north of Philly. And I'm the Associate for Digital Content for Lifelong Learning at VTS. And like Lisa, I get asked to talk about burnout and self-care because I'm not great at it. So my name
you're really good at the burnout. You're maybe not so
the
good
third or fourth time I've done some version of burnout, self-care, digital fatigue for the department. So I every time I present, I feel like I'm a little better than I was before. But so I'm glad to be here and be with you all today.
I'm so glad you're here, Keith. Thank you. Allison, Dr. St. Louis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison, and it's such a joy to be with you this afternoon. I am so passionate about helping folks to reclaim and to live from an awareness of their inherent dignity, worth, and belovedness in God. And I do so primarily from doing therapy and spiritual direction, doing some teaching, and also workshops and retreats. And I do that from my private practice in York, Pennsylvania, where I live with my husband, Jonathan, and our dog, Lulu, who teaches me a lot about self-care.
I think you may not have said this. I just want to add she's also an Episcopal priest. And as Keith indicated, he's an ordained Lutheran pastor. So for those of you who are ordained, the intersection of self-care and the call on your lives, the public witness of your ministries can sometimes be a particularly challenging intersection. For those of us like myself who are baptized Christians in ministry, sometimes the self-care that the institution assumes we are capable of is pretty invisible. We're sort of on our own to figure it out. So this is a conversation for all of us, but I really value that we have the breadth of experience that we do. And it's just delightful to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to move it to Keith, who's going to give us a little of his personal story. He hinted at it earlier.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I feel like, as I said before, I'm familiar with burnout and the challenges of self-care. And I just want to share a little bit of my COVID journey. And because I also feel like I'm a little bit of in this discussion, maybe if I can be maybe a little bit of a stand-in for some of you who have also kind of gone through some challenges during this COVID time, or before, or now even coming after. Even though things are opening up, there's still a lot of new stressors that go with reopening, even though it's really joyful. So as I was looking back on last year, just my last year, we made the decision to close our church building on March 12th, around the same time that many of you did. We were 4 hours ahead of the state of Pennsylvania, which we were very proud of, that we were kind of on top of things, and felt pretty good about that. But that in and of itself was a lot. I wound up having my first ever panic attack in April of 2020. It was a Saturday. We were having an at-home prom for my daughter who missed her junior prom, and lots of great festivities happening, and a slowly creeping feeling like I was having a heart attack. And said to my wife, I think we need to go to the hospital. So I was texting my council president and my field ed student on the way to the hospital saying, I won't be able to do Zoom church tomorrow. Can you please figure it out? And went down and of course had to get COVID, tested and looked at, and no, it was a panic attack. So it was bad. It was late during the night, got back home, and I was really laid low by that. And fortunately have a pastoral support team at church that's really great. But I remember being on a call after that with my pastoral support team, and my wife Jenny was doing all the talking because I was so wiped. I could see my face on the Zoom. So, kind of got myself back together pretty well, okay, after that. And then, like so many people, had to take on extra tasks, right? So we had to figure out staff furloughing and what that meant. Do we do a PPP loan? Do we do PUA, pandemic unemployment insurance? Just tons of decision fatigue, tons of Zoom meetings, creating digital worship from scratch. And then we were in the midst of a transition because my colleague who retired from pastoral ministry at just before the pandemic, good for her, was moving on. So we were in the process of onboarding a transition pastor at the time. And then we were realized in the process, we had to reorganize our office to better fit the needs of the congregation, is what we were learning. So we reorganized our office structure and staffing also. And all on the while tending to people's grief and anxiety and anger and fear and worry, as well as my own. And I really just broke down August, September 2020. So I wish I'd had a panic attack. It would have been easier to know the state I was in. I didn't. I was really too worn down and just reached a tipping point, and I was just wiped. And so at that point, and I had never experienced anxiety in that way before. Always been very busy, very productive, very active, go, but not really felt kind of an incapacitating anxiety, which I had felt for the first time, and a real sense of dread. So around that time, we realized, well, we need more than what we did last time with the panic attack. So I had a good friend who is a doctor of mine step in, and she worked with me, was kind of between doctors. And so she worked with me, prescribed me anti-anxiety meds, did a lot of work up for me. And I'm still on those anti-anxiety meds. Found a therapist, and I'm really grateful to have friends and be able to have health coverage and mental health coverage, because those things are not accessible or affordable enough. And we are living through a mental health crisis and pandemic, just as we're living through a COVID-19 pandemic. So I think we could go to the next slide. So kind of in the process of finally hitting the wall, I'd already thought I'd hit it. I really hit it the second time, and really needed to form support teams, lean on my pastoral support team. My friend Margie, who's a doctor, who really helped put me back together, finding a therapist through our employment assistance program, who I'm still with now. And they tell you to kind of have this team together, and I sort of do, but I really needed like a really stronger team that I had to kind of assemble. One of my things is I'm not good at asking or accepting help. I had this thing where spent a lot of time reflecting on my need to do it myself and by myself and not let anybody down, and that is exhausting. And my need to be for perfectionism as well. So just asking for help, accepting help. I've been really trying to focus on, since that time, sustainability. And the books I'm going to reference are in the resources at the end of the slide deck. You'll get them all. But one book I read that was really helpful was Atomic Habits by James Clear. And it's really talks about, I'm a person that kind of go, crash, go, crash, go, crash. Whether that's fitness, whether that's work, that's just the cycle. And recognizing for the long haul, I've got to get out of that cycle. And he talks about atomic habits as creating small habits, and the important part being the consistency of those habits over time. So whether it's a short thing, it's a small habit, that over time, they have this kind of atomic, really powerful effect. So working on these atomic healthy habits, confronting old patterns and understanding why I have those old patterns, and practicing self-compassion, all of which I'm still working on a lot. I've been burnt out before. I had never been burnt out like this and so laid low. But in the end, on this side of it, I think also I just want to say there's also a lot of stuff that happened before COVID that I also was carrying. So like, you carry like, I don't know, maybe your normal load of things, right? And you're dealing with them, or maybe you'll deal with them later. And then the pandemic comes up, and it's like all the things you were carrying for maybe the last couple of years also hit, while you're dealing with this very present crisis, because you're so compromised. And I definitely felt that too. So it wasn't just kind of this one moment, but it was also an accumulation. So yeah, I've been burned out before and never like this. And I don't feel like I have a lot of wisdom to share because I'm still in the journey, but I just wanted to share a bit of this journey for me, because maybe you've had some version of this journey. Some of you may have it easier and some may have had it worse, but this is just my own journey. But I really, I appreciate all the work that everybody's put into leading their faith communities and how hard that's been. And there's just not a lot of places that you can go with it. And there are places, if you're lucky, that you can go with it. And, my hope for us is that this can be a place that we can hold that together in this time, and kind of look forward to holding that with you, holding this space with you, and Dr. Kimball and Dr. St. Louis, and being together in this.
Thank you so much, Keith. As I say a few words, if you have questions for Keith or later for Dr. St. Louis, and you would like to have us try to respond to them, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to keep chatting in the chat box directly to the panelists or to all of us, the participants and the panelists. Keith, I want you to know there have been several comments, just deeply grateful for your honesty and your vulnerability. And one particular comment that was someone whose experience echoes much of yours, but has not felt safe sharing that with anyone yet. So I think you've already created a space where that's possible, for which I'm deeply grateful. I just would wonder if you talk about the atomic habits. I think that's such a lovely image, the idea of starting small, very specific. Can you think of one example that you would put in that category from your own life? One thing you've tried that's very specific that has helped you?
Yeah. So And part of one of the strategies in Atomic Habits is pairing a habit you already do with a new habit, and he calls it stacking habits. And you can go online, and he has a lot of this online as well. So I started stacking habits of I brush my teeth, then I weigh myself, which I don't do every kind of a healthy mindfulness thing. I have my cup of coffee, I take my meds, which I've been doing for a while, but it's still newer. He talks about when you're working out, when you're exercising, he said, the habit is not doing the exercise. The habit is getting in your workout clothes.
That's great.
And I started exercising, and I intentionally picked as like a 30-minute tops, streaming workout thing that you can do. So instead of I would normally go, now I'm going to go run 5 miles, and burn myself out on running. I'm going to do 30 minutes every day. I'm going to do something small every day. And then eventually I did get an Apple Watch, and there are things on there like keeping track of your blood pressure and kind of calories and movement. And that's actually been a good encouragement for me too. It has a reminder to breathe, a reminder to stand, and some goals in terms of exercise that you can set in a day. And that has been, those little rings kind of work, but that's been really helpful for me to be more mindful of what my body needs, which helps my mental state.
To have healthy feedback loops, right? To have a sense of what information is good information for each of us, and what information for some of us is too much. I've heard other people talk about the stress that their watches give them, that just reminds them of what they're failing at. So finding the time for us to use the tools that are available to us, but to use them well, and to be discerning about, they're not, all things are not for all people. But that's such a good example. So there was a name if you could say once again the name of the author for Atomic Habits. I know it's on the resource slide at the end.
It's James Clear, and he has a good little newsletter. Email newsletter you can subscribe to.
It's really, really helpful. I think I'm going to move us to hear from Dr. St. Louis so that we have all of the presentation, and then we'll have some more time for Q&A with her and with Keith, perhaps together. I want to be sure we get to as many of your questions as possible. So thank you so much again. That was really a lovely place for us to begin.
Thank you so much, Keith. I really appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty and your creation of a safe space for us. As Lisa noted, one person stated that it hasn't always felt safe to share where we are. And that's such an important part of our healing journey. I'd like to share with you some of my own thoughts about self-care. And these have come from about 20 years of experience with informal conversations, with clergy, with lay folks in leadership, also from working with clergy and laity and seminarians in spiritual direction and therapy. But before I begin my portion of the presentation, I'd like to hear from you. So using the chat box, feel free to share your answers to the following 3 questions. The first one is, what word associations come to mind when you hear the term self-care? What word associations come to mind when you hear the word self-care? And Lisa will share some of those with us in a bit.
I'm going to let people post a little so there's some space.
Yes.
These are good.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm noticing they and this makes sense, right? They kind of are on the positive end and then on the more self-critical end, right? So the first one I think that popped up was indulgence. And then there's a variety of them that seem to talk about practices. So nutrition, sleep, naps, comfort, peace, mental clarity, breathing. That's at the heart of self-care for sure. Someone was referring to walking and hiking and the dog, right? Walking the dog, being with our pets. So there are a few people who've mentioned balance. I think the question of balancing our schedule, balancing the rhythms of our life, that seems to be a place we look. Pink bubble bath, that's awfully fun. Critically important to life. Someone's instinct is to say, this matters. probably why you registered and why you're here, and we're glad you are. Self-love and practice. Time off. Several references to time. And others with boundaries, several references to drinking water, eating well, getting outdoors, that it's important, knowing where to start, relaxation, more emphasis on breathing.
Okay.
Overused word, underused action. That's a good
Yeah.
transition back to you.
Yes. So folks already know much of what needs to happen around self-care. But I'm going to then ask you to move to the second question, which is a survey. And so on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being very dissatisfied and 10 being very satisfied, how satisfied are you with your current level of self-care?
Put these responses in the poll on your screen if you can. That way we get to see sort of how that we build this as a group, which is helpful to us all. So not in the chat box, in the poll that should be showing up right now on your screen.
We have 74%, 76%. Let me know when you want me to close it.
Let's give it just a little bit more time.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else want to vote? Feel free to do that. Ooh, we're 68 out of 85. This is excellent. 80% have voted. So you can all see, we'll see the results in just a moment. That's probably good, Catherine.
Yeah, okay, all right, great. So then I'm going to ask you a question that I'd like you to respond to in the chat box, and that is, why not the number below the one you chose? So if you chose a 6, why didn't you choose a 5?
So the first person jumped in with, because she's working intentionally on this.
Mm-hmm.
Mindful of boundaries and sleep. Trying to do better. Being more attentive recently. 5 seemed neutral. So that person's good about forcing themselves to be honest. Beginning to pay particular attention. Just moved to a first call, so there's particular care and a focus on this. Someone's referring to new habits they've introduced, particularly with sleep, hygiene, and prayer.
Great.
So some intent, I hear themes of intentionality, that the people who they were thoughtful about where they were because they have added something to their life or become aware of something.
Right. So that brings me to the fact that we've already had some successes around self-care. We know what we need to do. It's more a matter of can we do them or what gets in the way of doing them. If you'd like to share 1 or 2 self-care activities that you're currently doing well or have done well in the past, feel free to do that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end of the presentation. Oh, sleep, that's a good one. Yes. So while you're doing that, I'm going to turn briefly to the pandemic and self-care. Now, one step towards healthy self-care is a willingness to face reality. That means admitting to ourselves and to others that the pandemic has taken its toll on our physical, spiritual, and emotional lives. From the stress of dealing with high levels of uncertainty to having to pivot on an almost daily basis to having to learn new ways of doing life. An example of the high level of stress created by the pandemic is the rapid learning many of us have had to do in the area of technology. At the start of the pandemic, some of us would have fallen into the unconscious incompetence quadrant of Maslow's stages of competence regarding the technological knowledge needed to set up and lead Zoom meetings, to participate in live stream worship, to offer Christian education or pastoral care in virtual ways. On top of that, so adding to our stress level was the angst of living for what seemed like forever in stage 2, conscious incompetence, the painful recognition that we were far from being proficient in those skills, and the pressure to learn them as quickly as possible. Add to that the stress of being confronted daily with a potentially fatal disease, along with a myriad of other painful events. And it's no surprise that many of us found ourselves on an emotional roller coaster, from frustration and anger to anxiety and grief to loneliness and despair. So an invitation to some personal reflections, and you don't have to share these in the chat box unless you want to. So which emotions have you experienced during this past year? And then how do they show up in your body? Do they show up in your head with headaches, or in your shoulders, in your neck, in your lower back, in your stomach, elsewhere in your bodies? And then this question, have you been gentle with and kind to yourself as you would with a good friend facing a similar situation? Truth be told, the pandemic also revealed some underlying issues regarding the consistency and quality of our self-care. The first issue I'd like to spend a few minutes on is our image of God. So initially formed from childhood experiences, what we learned in church, at home, in nature, through movies and so on, our image of God influences if and how we engage or don't engage God in our daily lives. Cardinal Basil Hume illustrates this in a story about the God image he received from his mother when he was a child. One day, she called him into the kitchen and said, "I'm going to put these cookies I just baked into a cookie jar and leave it on the table. But don't you dare sneak in here and eat any of them before dinner. Remember, God is watching you." For years, he lived in the fear of this always watchful God of the cookie jar. He did many wonderful things for God, but he did most of them out of fear. Freedom came when it dawned on him one day that if he had snuck into the kitchen, taken a cookie and ate it, God probably would have said, "Basil, they're so good. Why don't you have another one?" Thankfully, like Cardinal Hume, those of us who grew up with an image of God as a policeman or a judge or as a disinterested, distant figure have since had some life-changing experiences with a loving, compassionate, and merciful God. So I'm going to invite you to think about the image that you currently hold of God. And as you hold that, I'm going to go into the next part of the presentation, which is our image of ourselves. So the second underlying issue, our image of ourselves, shapes and is shaped by our image of God. A personal example, my experience of God during my adult years helped me to embrace the image of a generous, loving God. But when I am stressed, another image of God sometimes resurfaces, that of a withholding God. I notice by the changes I observe in my prayer life. I go from prayers of thanksgiving, intercession, and oblation to complaining and cajoling and fussing with God. But with the help of prayer, therapy, and spiritual direction, over the years, I connected my behavior with an image of God that was associated with one that I had growing up in a household in which withholding, whether of affection, connection, or money, was one of the ways the adults in our family sometimes dealt with one another and with their children. Which brings me to another way in which our self-image is formed, through our assigned roles in our families of origin, which in turn can have a far-reaching impact on our level of self-care. For example, in my family, one of my roles was the mediator. So it was easy to be caught in the drama between two or more persons, which meant that without developing clear boundaries, I could easily take on the stress of other people's relationships. So another invitation to personal reflection. In your family of origin, what was your primary role? Here are some common ones to think about. Were you the problem solver, the peacemaker, the caregiver, the crisis manager, the good one, the perfect child, the overachiever, the overfunctioner, or some other one? Do you find yourself automatically filling that role in your adult relationships, including in your ministry setting? And if so, how does it impact your level of self-care? Let's move to the third underlying issue. And this is a really significant one because it is how we talk to or about ourselves. If we see ourselves as unworthy or not good enough, we may engage in harsh, critical self-talk. How many times have you heard someone chastise themselves using words like idiot or stupid? Such automatic thoughts are really distortions of the truth. Let's look at a few common ones. There are about 11, but we only have time for me to name about 3. So these are the 3 that I chose. One is all or nothing, either or thinking. So I'll give my personal example is when I am stressed or if I have to wait and wait and wait, my image of God as withholding comes knocking at the door, and I'm easily tempted to think and act as though it's all up to me. Either I do it or it will not get done. All or nothing, either or thinking. The second one is mental filter. Dwelling on the negatives and ignoring the positives. I know those of us who preach sometimes do that. So even though many folks tell us it was a wonderful sermon, we might tend to focus on the one negative comment that someone made to us. Mental filter. And the last one is the shoulds, oughts, and musts that assault us. So I should be available whenever they need me. So which one or ones do you use, if any? If you'd like to put any of those in the chat box, so all or nothing thinking, mental filter, or shoulds, oughts, or musts. All 3, okay. So lots of all or nothing, shoulds, all 3. Okay. So then let's spend the last few minutes of my presentation looking at some what I call lifelong self-care habits for sustainable ministry. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is that these habits, developing these habits means breaking some old habits, forming new ones, which takes time and practice. Secondly, we might be in an institution or in a community that doesn't always support the development of healthy habits. And thirdly, sometimes we know what to do, but we don't always know, or we don't always do what we know what we need to do. So the first one I'd like to look at is challenging unhelpful self-talk. And I use resources from cognitive behavioral therapy, which was developed by Aaron Beck, because I believe that self-care starts in the mind. Cognitive behavioral therapy uses techniques to help us recognize, challenge, and replace unhelpful thoughts that often lead to unhelpful behaviors. For instance, we can learn to use the double standard method, which is instead of harshly condemning ourselves, we can talk to ourselves the way we would to a friend in a similar situation. Or we could use something called the semantic method, which is substituting language that is less colorful or loaded. So instead of, I shouldn't have made such a stupid mistake, we could say instead, it would have been better if I hadn't made that mistake. So taking out those loaded words. There are many other resources from cognitive behavioral therapy. You can access those from just doing a search online. There are lots of exercises that you can do on your own. There are some that you might want to do with a friend or an accountability partner. There are others that you might then work with a therapist on, depending on the situation that you are dealing with. So then I'd like to move to cultivating internal resources. And for these, I tend to look at solution-focused therapy, which was developed by Steve de Chazar and Enzo Kimberg. And what I like about solution-focused therapy is it can help us to focus on what is working and then to do more of it. So for instance, in our exercise at the beginning, why did we not give ourselves a lower number on the satisfaction with self-care scale? So what are we doing already that's working? How can we do more of it? We can also look at something called exceptions. So even though, for instance, I might feel like I'm not taking care of myself at all, are there times when I do, and what helps me to do so? So what are the exceptions? And to focus on those and to build those. And then the other piece that's helpful to me is Bowen Family Systems Theory, which was of course developed by Murray Bowen. And that can help us to take care of ourselves by developing firm but flexible boundaries and avoiding triangulation and overfunctioning. And lastly, looking at external resources. The one that I would recommend is the American Psychological Association's website, because they have a variety of resources, number of articles on topics from burnout to childcare during the pandemic to keeping ourselves sane during this time. So just a number of different approaches that might be helpful depending on your needs. So lastly, I'd say these psychological tools really can help us to do our part in moving into the freedom of God. That is freedom from constantly feeling a need to earn God's love, to prove ourselves, to gain a sense of self-worth from what we do or produce, own or control, or from the approval or applause of other people. Freedom from being vulnerable to feeling responsible for instead of responsible to other adults, to being at the mercy of other people's whims, to having fuzzy or rigid boundaries, or to being afraid of saying no or asserting ourselves. Freedom to create space for God to remind us that we are God's beloved, which then gives us permission to care well for the gift that is our one precious life. So I'd like to close by sharing a brief reflection on the secret of Holy Communion by Cardinal Hume. He said, "When you are lost and very hungry, you have a craving for two things, for food and drink, and for love. May we create space in our lives for God to pour God's love into us, and then out of a deep sense of being and knowing that we are God's beloved, share that love with others." Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, so much. I've had the privilege of working near Allison, next to Allison, as a colleague here on the faculty at Virginia Seminary in an earlier iteration of her vocation. And I think you just had a taste of what I have always known, which is When Allison's voice is in the room, my whole body relaxes. My shoulders drop. My heartbeat settles. Your wisdom and your clarity and your life witness as a Christian is beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you.
And we do have some questions. I'm going to ask them. They kind of go back and forth between the two of you. And there's some lovely comments in the chat box, which I think both of you have been able to watch a little. Just the level of engagement suggests that this topic is relevant for people. And I'm glad to say that in the midst of the challenges and the shoulds and the sense of what we can do to undo some of the cognitive habits that have not helped us, there's a lot to celebrate. A number of people here are talking about being more aware, more intentional now than they used to be, particularly around transition. And that leads into one of the first questions. Derek Miller, who actually just graduated from VTS with an Anglican Studies diploma, says, for those of us stepping into newer ministry in a post-pandemic, hopefully, setting, how can we set good patterns now while also being aware of the needs and experiences of those who have endured the pandemic before we have joined into ministry with them? So beginning new, not yet knowing your community. How can either of you speak to sort of individual practices and also beginning to help your community do this well as they enter? Keith, I see you unmuting. Go for it.
Yeah, I just think thanks for that question, Derek. I think it's a very sensitive observation. You're coming in new and you've got people there have been working very hard. Oftentimes when new pastors arrive, people start quitting their volunteer roles. It's sort of just part of the, the person's here, I've helped hold it together, I'm ready to hand it off. And that might even be more the case with COVID. So it's an interesting kind of emotional systems moment for you. I think it's really wise to be sensitive to that, and under any circumstance, we just still need lots of opportunities for people to process what they've experienced and what has happened, both personally and as a congregation. It's going to take a while. So I think creating opportunities as you're kind of leaning into for people to share those experiences, to breathe, to grieve, is going to be really, and to say, I'm done, is really okay. And for you to set kind of good, that's a great witness and a great ministry. And, and you have an opportunity together, I think, to do some Sabbath practices, that you're not the only one that needs to establish that. It's very present for folks you're serving.
Yeah, I agree with Keith. I think I would encourage folks who are moving into new settings during this time to also, again, be very sensitive that we are living in extraordinary times. At the same time, some of the practices that we would do in non-pandemic times are also practices that we can engage in pandemic times, which is taking time to get to know people, spending time with folk, helping them to get to know you a little bit better, helping them to have a sense that you are a safe person, that they can trust you, and that they can share some of the grief and the sadness, the anger, the angst, and whatever else comes up for them in their time with you. That can be very cathartic for folks. At the same time, I also think it's important to have some clear boundaries, to know our limits, to know that we can't be all things to all people. And so to continue the healthy self-care habits that we have developed for ourselves, which sometimes means saying no to unreasonable and certainly even sometimes unreasonable requests. Because if we keep going down the path of trying to be present to people at all times, then we are likely to end up in a difficult situation ourselves. So it's balancing both in my mind.
Thank you both. Sarah Bentley Allred, who's one of our team members here at Lifelong Learning, put something in the chat. She says, when I start new, I always try to establish days off very firmly and put it in my email signature. So the idea that setting healthy boundaries at the beginning is much easier than trying to carve them out once people have accepted you as always available or always accessible. So that idea of how do people need to hear that? Her idea of putting it into her email signature, as well as telling people or having the parish staff, if there's other team of people, know what her plans are. That's really helpful, Sarah. Thank you. I want to go to another question here that came from Dean Shelley, and who's in Trinidad, which is really exciting. She says, Keith talked about decision fatigue. How did he identify that? And how has he been able to address that specifically? And Allison, you may well have things about that too.
So I don't think I knew what decision fatigue was, but I read a profile Michael Lewis did of President Obama back in 2012. And it talked about how President Obama didn't wear different color suits because it would be one more decision he'd have to make in a busy day. And so one way of thinking
That's why some of us love uniforms.
Yeah, that's right. I don't have my collar on, but that's one of the reasons I like my collar. It's just black and put the collar on. So, thinking about decision fatigue in terms of what are things I'm deciding every day that if I just had a system or an atomic habit, that were more rote, which is something that I'm not great at. Some people are more regimented, and I think it sort of takes some of the decision-making out of some of the processes. When I get decision fatigue, to me, it feels like a computer whose RAM is full. Like I start to slow down, and I really need to get away from it till I defragment or I get more space, like I go for a walk and I get more RAM back, so that I can do what I do. I think I also can get into things where what decisions are mine to make and what decisions are for other people. Just because I'm the pastor, they're not all my decisions, but I feel responsible for everything. So I sometimes treat them as they are. So what's for me and what's for others?
That's great.
Yeah. I like to use at times Stephen Covey's piece around decisions that we often, or activities we often engage in that may not necessarily be important, but they feel really urgent. And so just doing that exercise of having, for instance, on the y-axis, important, not important, and then on the x-axis, urgent, not urgent, and see how much of my time am I spending in these quadrants. And as Keith pointed out so well, which of those decisions are really mine to make and which are someone else's to make, so that I am not then prioritizing my time around somebody else's agenda.
There's a question that is sort of the other side of someone Derek, who asked the question about starting fresh and being careful and intentional. Someone else is asking the question, David is asking the question, especially for clergy staff, although I would say as a lay professional, this has been true for me too. Self-care is a systemic issue. And he says that it goes beyond the individual's decision to include the expectations of the congregation, as well as of all the common lack of ownership and the functioning of the community by congregants. So how can we help a community address an issue that may already be pervasive? You can recognize it, you can see that it's not healthy, but you're just one person in that system. And particularly, let's assume people are not the person in charge. Let's say that they're not the senior pastor, they're maybe the associate or the Christian formation leader. Any suggestions about how do we begin to model and to begin to be a system change person in that kind of setting? Allison, yeah.
I think one of the things that's really helpful to me is to think about, are there other people in the system who are also functioning up in that way? Are there other people who have healthy habits or who are interested in developing healthy habits that we can use as a support system? It's really hard to go against the grain of a system. So having others that can journey with us is one source of support. The other piece is that, while a system has a lot of power, we also have a lot of personal power as individuals. It may not always feel like that. I'm remembering Alice Walker, who said, those who feel like, people feel like they don't have any personal power, basically ones who are just giving up their personal power. So to be able to be clear with our expectations and to have the dialogue that often needs to happen to assert ourselves in, again, ways that we might find difficult to do, but we can do if we, again, have the support of other people who can help us to frame the conversation with, let's say, a supervisor, where we can feel, yes, I can say this. It takes some courage to say it, and I'm taking a risk to say it, but being able to do that, I think, is really important. So sort of modeling for others in the system, our healthy habits can actually help others to then make the decision to engage in healthy behaviors. Not everyone will, but that's okay. That's part of that journey towards differentiating ourselves within a particular system. Healthy people will come on board, unhealthy people probably not. So,
and it may be uglier than that. They may resist it or sort of point fingers, actually sabotage it, right? Yeah, that's very important to pay attention. Keith, were you trying to say something there?
Yeah, I just kind of laughed. The memory came to mind where I had a sabbatical in 2019, and I had a sabbatical planning group. And one of the people clarified, we were talking about overachieving. We live in an overachieving area and an overachieving culture. And she said, no, not overachieving, high achieving. So that's where we are. So I was just thinking that, you know, we're in a kind of high achieving culture in our church. You know, a lot of very professional people, a lot of successful people, a lot of very available to their job people. And so, you know, I think that really spills in a lot. So I do wind up talking about Sabbath a lot, and I practice Sabbath better than I used to. But I think it's you know, I'm just aware of how pervasive that is, not only, you know, in the church system, but in the systems that our parishioners are working in. And sometimes I feel guilty, you know, it's like, well, if they're working and they're available to their job, you know, and I know I need the time off, and if I don't take the break, then I'm not serving them well. But nonetheless, when they're taking the time as volunteers to email me or reach out to me, and I'm the pastor, can be hard to say no.
I'm looking at the time, and we have just 5 minutes, and there's some really good questions coming in, which is part of why this topic is so important to us. So we're going to share some slides in a minute here with some more resources that we hope can be helpful for you going forward. I am going to plant a question, though, that I think I want to hear you both just speak briefly about. One of the areas where I experience people struggling around self-care is fundamentally this use of the word balance. The idea that we are all striving for some ideal balance between work and whatever that other thing is, right? Work life. And it becomes particularly difficult in my experience in the church, because for many of us, our work is a calling. Our work is our vocation. Those of you who are ordained are not ordained when you're resting. So how does our call, so say a little about whether the word balance is helpful to you, where does it fit? Give people some tips about how to be gentle with themselves, if that standard seems to be a threat. Allison, do you want to?
Sure. I used to like the word balance, but I don't anymore, because I find it's very difficult to keep balance from day to day. So I think in terms of, you know, I have one life, and I only have a certain amount of time, a certain amount of energy. How best can I use the time and the energy that I have? How best can I co-create a life with God that is one that serves, that brings a measure of joy, and that is life-giving for me and for the people who are in my company. I don't want to be a great priest and then I come home and a grumpy wife, or most of the time be a grumpy wife. So I try to think in terms of resources and how can I partner with God from day to day in making decisions that are sort of the best use of my time. And for me, having a sort of purpose, you know, we talk about purpose statement. Sometimes I have a purpose statement. So what fits into that and what doesn't fit into that? And if my purpose is to help others to have a sense of reclaiming their dignity and their sense of belovedness, then the tasks that I take on fit well with that purpose statement. And then I say no to other things. And that helps me then to keep within that area of health for the most part.
That's lovely, Allison. Thank you.
Yeah. Wow.
Keith,
I don't find balance to be particularly helpful. It sort of intimates there's this idealized state that is achievable, and that's not been my experience. So, and then it makes it feel like a failure that I'm not balanced. And so I spent a lot of time with my 1-year-old puppy, and and try to walk and try to get outside, try to pay attention to my body. I've been trying to listen to my body more and practice more self-compassion. Like, well, if I'm tired, it's okay that I'm tired. Whereas before it would be like, I don't have time to be tired, like predator. I don't have time to bleed. I just got to keep going. And that's been a challenge for me. But, and maybe that means like I go a little later to work, or maybe that means I do my walk or I don't do my walk, or, just to pay attention and have some, as Allison was saying, the compassion you would extend to someone else to extend to yourself. I just think, I don't know, ministry leaders extend compassion and care and grace and forgiveness to others in such abundant ways. And we don't always offer those same things to ourselves.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. And to all of you who've logged in today, you gave yourself a little gift, an hour, we hope, of space where you were reminded of your beauty and your worth and your belovedness, and that you're not alone in this journey of finding wellness in the midst of all that is demanded of you and all the opportunities there are. So these are the resources that we will be sending to you in the slides. They are just some of the many, many resources we commend to you. We have regular office hours, which many of you know, on Thursday afternoons. There will be a hyperlink in these slides to register for them. We're taking a little break in July, but we are also always available to you for consultations, support, resource recommendations. That's what the team here at Virginia Seminary offers. We have resources in lifelong learning, all of the things related to journeying with God through Jesus Christ across the lifespan. We have practical resources for Christian formation leaders and teachers and educators in building faith. We have digital practice resources and think tank spaces for people like you who may be trying to imagine a new way forward in the midst of our digital age. So thank you for joining us, and particularly thank you to my colleagues and my dear friends, Allison and Keith, and Catherine for hosting this. We are blessed by each of you and your witness. Thank you for the honesty and the generosity with which you shared. So be well, everyone. And the real summer is just 10 days away. And remember the lazy days of summer. May you find some, and may you claim them, and may you lie on your back in the grass if it doesn't give you allergies, and just enjoy. Okay. Go forth, be well, and we're glad you were here.
Thank you. Blessings.
Peace, everyone.
Bye. Peace.